Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Thomas Coleman. He is a PhD student at Coventry University and a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Bialystok in Poland as part of the Society and Cognition Unit. He draws on multiple approaches from across the sciences and humanities to study the origins, development, and maintenance of non-religious and religious worldviews. His research focuses on three areas: identifying and measuring components of non-religious worldviews, computer-simulated models of the cognitive and social dynamics leading to non-belief in supernatural agents, investigating how and why moral motivations are stereotypically attributed to religious as opposed to non-religious factors. So, Thomas, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Great. Thank you very much for having me on.
Okay, so today we're going to talk about the psychology of religious and non-religious people and compare them a little bit. So to start off with, is there something about the psychology of religious people that distinguishes them from non-religious people? I mean, is there some sort of cognitive mechanism or cognitive mechanisms in the plural that religious people might have that non-religious people lack?
I would answer not in a black and white sense in terms of it being a dichotomy. But if we think about it in terms of a spectrum, we do know that if we have the heavily non-religious non-believers at one end and the devoutly religious believers on the other end, that there are certain cognitive and psychological tendencies that tend to co-occur with these sets of beliefs. One example might be, which perhaps we'll hit on again, the highly religious are more likely to be, for example, dogmatic than atheists, although atheists do show some tendencies here and there. Some other tendencies that they're also shared, one of them is called mentalizing or empathizing sometimes. So this is still being heavily investigated, but several past researches have found that people who are more religious score higher on this trait called mentalizing. Also, in terms of non-believers, we typically find they score higher on personality traits like openness to experience. Typically, less need for cognitive closure, more okay with tolerance of ambiguity, for example. By and large, though, we share similar cognitive systems, although they may be tuned slightly different. But it's many different types of religiosity, or hopefully we'll get to ways to kind of not believe. But being an atheist or non-believer isn't monolithic, as we'll see.
Mm-hmm. And by the way, since you mentioned the fact that atheism or non-belief is not monolithic, what you just said, does it apply to all religions or not?
Yes, certainly. I think it would be a mistake to lump all religions or all believers into one category. Speaking from my own experience and upbringing, my mother is a Methodist, extremely liberal. I never really, talking to many of my atheist friends and such, I find they had the religion beat out of them, so to speak, is something they say never occurred in my household. My mom would say she's religious, but extremely liberal, and so I know that there are many different kind of orientations, sometimes denominations that also impact the type of religiosity someone expresses.
Mm-hmm. And what about agnostics? How should we deal with those people?
Agnostics. So in terms of the psychology or cognitive science behind agnosticism, we know almost next to nothing. This is, perhaps, well, in terms of the psychology of atheism, non-belief, it's only something that has kind of risen to prominence in the past 10 years or so. And if you were asking me some of these questions today, 10 years ago, would be lacking lots of answers for many of them. And agnostics are, they're slowly coming under the lens of social scientists. And again, to be honest, we don't know that much about them. I will say that the few studies that have been done and my own master's research previously showed that they do differ in some interesting ways on certain personality traits and even perhaps cognitive tendencies. And we need more work on that. So I don't think there's too much we can say right now. And I'll give you one problem here. Agnosticism is often, depending on your definition, seen as either withholding belief or even perhaps an uncertainty. Sometimes it's also confused with apathy. Just not caring about, one's own non-belief or religious issues or religiosity. But we know that for some individuals, there's qualitative work that shows agnosticism or even uncertainty can be very firmly held, reasoned, articulated positions. So we're still really trying to figure out about agnostics, or even the types, for example, of agnosticism, whether one is firm or in their agnosticism, or more along the lines of apathy.
Mm-hmm. So when we talk about religious beliefs, are they fundamentally different from other types of beliefs or not?
I'm going to say at different levels, yes and no. So one of the say leading, but something that's been proposed over the past 6-7 years, is that religious beliefs, and we'll throw into this also political beliefs, are not like factual beliefs in the sense that, for example, I'm operating with this factual belief that unsupported objects will fall to the ground, and hence I don't try to let go of my coffee cup in midair. Because this belief is always active in my head, guiding my behavior. Other beliefs, of which some religious beliefs are a subset, are more kind of like imaginings. This isn't to say that religion is just the stuff of imagination in terms of kind of throwing its relevancy or some serious debates out the window, but that religious beliefs operate different from facts. And that, for example, a particular religious belief might be God's omniscience, all-knowing. And if this was a kind of factual belief, at least in the same sense like gravity is, then there are probably many things religious individuals or others wouldn't do because God is all-knowing. But we also know that these beliefs, they're not active in all settings. Like they could be queued up more or less, similar to a political rally, where people are really getting pumped up about certain political tendencies and whatnot. That they are often active in some contexts, specifically within church, where you have pews, pastor, or priest, or imam, and such. And outside of the church, it can be slightly different issue. Not trying to suggest that religious people are particularly hypocrites, because we can all find something we're hypocritical about, but again, one distinction has been made at a very low level of between factual beliefs, again, like gravity, and things that are more closer to imagination. On the other hand, at a little bit higher level here, psychologists, usually psychologists of religion, have tried to make the case that religious beliefs, whatever they are extremely meaningful. I don't think too many people would argue with that, but also in the same way that other beliefs might be very meaningful to people. Often, I won't say confused, but intertwined with one's personal sense of identity, who they are. So, in that sense, or in both of those senses, religious beliefs and other beliefs, political, philosophical, moral beliefs, are certainly different from an everyday belief like, I'm talking to Ricardo Lopez right now, which is, right before me and present. I have no doubts about that.
Yeah, and since these beliefs are different from factual beliefs, is it really correct to say, as some atheists say, particularly more so the sort of militant atheistic types, when they argue that religious beliefs are irrational? Is that correct to say that they are irrational?
Without a doubt, I would say some are. So if someone is trying to tell me that the Earth is 4,000 years old, I'm very comfortable in saying that they are wrong, and that is just not, incorrect. But it gets more difficult when we kind of move up the ladder. So, for example, just saying like belief in God, and in at least an abstract sense. It's not really something that science could prove or disprove either way. When we get more specific, however, so for example, prayer, the efficacy of prayer, if we include this as a religious belief, all of the prayer studies that have been attempted have failed, and kind of a one way to look at this is, prayer doesn't work. Another way to look at that is, if there is a God, it's very hard to put them in the control condition. You're dealing with something on one hand that is, out of the natural kind of limits, as we know, for science. So, are religious beliefs irrational? I think we have some, depending on the belief, I would say yes. But I think we are increasingly understanding that we can manipulate people's, shift people's beliefs without their awareness. And so I think there's reason to cause doubt on, support doubt on certain things that, for example, religious experience. Someone says they have a religious experience, and if they take that as evidence, that God is real, we know that this one of the key mechanisms here is attribution. Well, they have attributed that experience to a God, and we've had laboratory settings, and I don't mean we, including myself, but colleagues, where they have been able to induce kind of mystical states and experiences. And religious people typically attribute this to religion. Non-religious people who have gone through the same procedure don't. That they range from aliens to just a pleasant, wild, interesting kind of time, which they don't label it as God or see it as evidence for that. So, on one hand, things like religious experience are, we know they're susceptible to influences that we could safely assume really aren't God. Last instance I can remember here is that there's been some studies showing that adults' reasoning about God's belief, what they think God believes, closely matches their own beliefs. So, and draw a comparison here, the same is not true for when they are asked to think about another individual's belief, like their cousin or a stranger. They're more, you will find that they're not similarly egocentric. So if God doesn't like, gays, lesbians, we often find that the individual, shares a similar belief. So by and large, what people think God believes is often closely similar to what they themselves profess to believe.
Mm-hmm. So earlier you mentioned one thing that I would like to explore a little bit more. When you talked about dogmatism, I mean, we tend to associate religious people with dogmatism and atheists with an undogmatic attitude. But should we make that distinction there? I mean, is it the case that all religious people fall on the camp of dogmatism and atheists fall on the camp of undogmatism, let's say?
Yeah, I would say certainly not. On one hand, again, for news articles and such and popular readings, there's a tendency when you hear the psychology of religion or cognitive science religion that we're all talking about the same thing, right? And people, if someone says, "Well, I'm religious," it's the psychology of religion, but I'm not dogmatic. There are many different kind of flavors and ways to be religious. Now, we do know and have good evidence for 50, 60 years that people who are more strongly religious and devout are more do have more rigid kind of beliefs that they hold, whether they're ethical, moral, or even ones that we would certainly say are less desirable, like racist, kind of sexist attitudes. We do know that non-religious, non-believers are less likely, much less likely, to have ethno-racial prejudices. I wouldn't say all, and not immune, but definitely socially liberal. So, non-believers, being socially liberal is extremely common. No surprise to probably anyone who's listening. However, there has been some interesting studies by my colleague and friend, Dr. Filip Uzerich, always going to kill me, Uzerovich, in Croatia, and he's done studies basically looking at are atheists prejudiced, or are they unprejudiced, to kind of flip that question. By and large, I'd say about a handful of several studies now show that yes, atheists can be fairly dogmatic and prejudiced in certain contexts, but this is very limited. And to give you an example, well, I'm going to say it's limited. I almost want to say that it just makes sense when you hear what I'm going to say. So, one of these experiments, individuals, atheist individuals, were asked, to help an individual who was religious. After class, after like attending a school class or something, they need help with their homework, or they drop their books in the hallway. So atheist and religious individuals are equally likely to help the individual after class, pick up their books, what have you, regardless of whether they're explicitly identified as, I'm Tommy the Mormon, can you help me pick up my books? Atheists in that context are not, just like religious individuals, they help. In contrast, though, where we have find some prejudice, is, if you want to call it that, is when religious individuals are asked an atheist or non-religious individual to help with a specific religious cause. For example, like proselytizing. And in one experiment I'm thinking of, individual atheists and believers were asked to help another Christian print off church pamphlets, or essentially proselytization material. What was found there? Atheists were much less likely to help in that context the religious individual. So you say, well, this kind of seems intuitive, right? Almost like, why don't we have I was about to say, why don't we have Republicans helping Democrats get elected? But currently in the United States, some would Some would make that claim, but just as we don't typically see, liberal people campaigning for conservatives, if you want to call that prejudice, I think it might be a stretch. But by and large, the prejudice that religious individuals have are dissimilar from some that atheists might have. And also, we do know, for example, that individuals who we've termed kind of anti-theists, not that this is our term, and many people identify with a certain term that use in a study, but that's not how we necessarily use the term. But in a 2014-2015 study looking at different types of the atheists in the US, we found, we conducted 60 or so interviews, and also had a quantitative survey part. And what we found is roughly 6 types of atheists, and one of them, important to this conversation, are called, we labeled anti-theists. Now, these individuals differed markedly from all of the other atheist groups on things like levels of anger, dogmatism. The anti-theists were indeed scored higher on dogmatism than all of the other atheists. And interestingly, though, they only made up about 7% of our sample. And so message here is, yes, atheists can be dogmatic just as others. They are less likely to be so than religious people are on social issues. But specifically when it comes to religion, certainly all the atheists are not unprejudiced. We certainly have loud and proud, not saying that someone who is loud and proud to be an atheist is an anti-theist, but we do have people who actively work and seek to essentially rid the world of religion. These people do tend to be more dogmatic, higher levels of anger and narcissism in some of the studies we've conducted than others.
Yeah, interesting. So you've also studied absorption, the phenomenon of absorption. What is absorption, and what is its relationship to mysticism?
Right. I'm glad you brought that up. Also, backtracking for a second, when we were talking about kind of the rationality of religious beliefs, we know that certain cognitive tendencies or psychological styles are more prone to hearing voices of God, experiencing, having visions, and so on. This is particularly true for a personality trait called absorption. And absorption is a trait was kind of identified, I think in the 70s, perhaps no surprise here, that's highly related to hypnotic susceptibility, but it is not the same thing as hypnosis. But it is a trait or tendency that allows people to become absorbed wholly, the full focus of their attention on maybe music, art. If you've best way to explain it is if you've ever had an experience where maybe you're driving a long country road somewhere and you just sort of zone out, and then you wake up and you're already at your destination. You see, time, that was fast. Might say you were it's not that you weren't paying attention. Your mind was somewhere, is focused on something, but it's not a type of attention. Sorry. So absorption is kind of an intentional process that we have it's not intentional, so to speak, as though you're sitting by a long lecture from a professor and you're like, God, I got to pay attention to this. Actively trying. It's a way where your mind sort of focuses on ideas or just drifts away without you knowing. And again, it's not that you're not paying attention, but your attention is not there in an instrumental way. And people who score higher on this trait, absorption, have a tendency to, it's highly related to imagination. for example, and more likely to have unusual experiences. Maybe hear voices, see things. Not trying to also make the point that absorption is, like a strange experience trait. It's not, but it is related to unusual experiences. And in two studies that recently conducted, we found that this trait absorption, again, a tendency for your mind to be fully engaged, but without a real conscious effort. We found that trait absorption was related to the self-report of mystical experiences. This kind of makes sense from one perspective, because we can, if we're talking about an experience where you kind of seem to, the hustle and bustle that surrounds you kind of fades away, and you're feeling kind of one with the universe, or the sublime state. Well, this personality trait absorption actually facilitates, in part, these experiences. So people who score higher on absorption also report more mystical experiences than people with lower levels of absorption. And the first to really bring the importance of absorption into the study of religion, at least in the past 10, 15 years, has been anthropologist Tanya Luhrmann, in a book called When God Talks Back. And over many hours of ethnography studies, she found that people who are higher in this trait for absorption are, again, more likely to have personal, intimate experiences of supernatural agents. And that for people who, the inverse here is that for people lacking trait absorption, it was actually harder to cultivate a sense of unseen agents. So one of the problems kind of with belief here is that it's not easy, because we're talking about something unseen. For many people, arguably takes faith, and to make something unseen feel more real does take a bit of a skill. It's not something that comes to people effortlessly, but as Luhrmann found, people who are higher in absorption are better able to train this ability to have these interesting experiences, including mystical experiences.
Mm-hmm. You also study worldviews. So, do atheism, agnosticism, and religiosity correspond to three different kinds of worldviews?
So I wouldn't back up for a second and say one of the reasons that this the worldviews perspective, we're going to say, is conceiving of atheism. Well, straight up atheists. Well, most atheists will tell you atheism just a lack of belief, nothing more, nothing less. And I wouldn't disagree with that. I think that's a good definition, but it puts studying atheists at a disadvantage in terms of psychology and social sciences, because we have one group, theists, religious individuals, who are being defined and measured on things that we would easily call worldviews. Yeah. So yes, it has to do with belief in God, but there's more there. There's communal aspects. There's also how people think, their image of God, their personal understanding of personal relationship. And all of these items and facets are usually packed into what we call as a measure of religiosity. And when we measure a religious person's level of religiosity, we're usually not just measuring, do you believe in God? Yes or no, or how strongly do you believe in God? We're measuring emotions, attitudes, effective engagements with other religious individuals, whether someone feels a part of a community. All of these items we measure as kind of components of religious worldviews. But if we go with atheism is defined negatively, but by what's missing, it sets up an uneven comparison. So we have one group who's being measured on things that they believe in. We'll bracket off what it is. And then we have another group, atheists, that are being measured by the one thing that they don't believe in. So what I say is, and several other social scientists are now advocating and developing this worldviews perspective, is that no, atheism in and of itself isn't a specific worldview, so to speak. Lack of belief. But yes, atheists do have worldviews. They do believe in other things, have values, meanings, experiences. They may not go to church, but they do other things. And so the worldviews perspective is a drive to not only move past the one thing that atheists don't believe in, but also to embrace things that they do believe in, and importantly, allowing us to make comparisons with religious individuals, and comparisons that are more equal. Again, and we look at different components of worldviews, such as sources of meaning, values. What do you think happens after you die? That this would be a worldview component that anyone can answer. Well, you may not walk around, with a fully articulated answer to this in your head, but we've done several studies now, and one recently with my advisor, Dr. Valerie Van Malocum, and several other international collaborators. This is a 10-country study we completed about a year ago, looking at and examining what atheists believe in. And we can bracket out the word belief here, because I know, atheists, myself included, you hear the word belief, you automatically associate this, with religion. Call these whatever you like, values, meanings, things that are important to oneself. But and across 10 different countries, we asked non-believers, atheists, what values, beliefs, meanings, or worldviews were important to them. They would list things. Some people, science, humanism, just being good to one another, were some different answers here. And then we asked them how they thought these beliefs worked or functioned in their own lives to provide meaning in dealing with grief. I don't want to say it's a problem, but if you're an atheist, someone dies, I think you're still going to grieve, whether you're religious or not. But how one does that, how one copes with this, is an interesting question. And we've only just started to begin to investigate how atheist, non-religious individuals cope with these things. So for the longest time in the psychology of religion, atheists, they were just assumed to be the opposite, whatever religion was, and that they basically lacked coping mechanisms. People, well, if you don't have religion, then what do you believe? I've heard that myself before, and common conversation. And the worldviews perspective is an attempt to get at different components of someone's worldview, their way of life, irrespective of whether or not they believe in God. And last thing here, I think we may find it interesting that some atheists and theists certainly have more in common than they often admit or think when we look at things from a worldview perspective, and we bracket out individual claims about God, and we look not what the source of morality is, but whether or not they think stealing is wrong, or if we should just kind of be excellent to all people. These little personal life philosophies are components that we're now trying to measure in non-religious individuals. That way we'll be able to compare non-religion with religion in a way that doesn't, on one side, there's a cup that's half full, and on the other side, the cup's half empty. So worldviews, atheists, no, atheism in and of itself isn't a worldview, but atheists do have worldviews, ways of understandings of the universe that help them make sense of their surroundings, of what happens when we die, and how we should behave and act in the world.
Mm-hmm. And would these worldviews include things like fatalism and nihilism, for example?
Yes, certainly can. So there are there's a long history of no surprise of prejudice against atheists, and particularly that they don't believe in anything. You don't believe in God. What then do you believe in? And it was often assumed, and I think a perfect example would be was it Pastor Rick Warren's The Purpose-Driven Life, that appeared a very popular book around 2003. And in his statement, one of the statements, and there's basically, without God, there's no reason, nothing's meaningful. Nothing has value, purpose is worth anything. Back up right there. Many atheists, all atheists as far as I'm concerned, would take issue with this. And instead of being nihilists who just, believe in nothing and don't care about anything, or, deterministic in that we're all just kind of doomed and there's nothing we can do to change anything. Atheists don't believe these kinds of things. And one study that we conducted with a representative sample of U.S. theists and atheists, we compared the two groups on not levels of, but whether or not they were indeed fatalists or had very kind of negative deterministic worldview, and we did not find any differences between the two groups. So although this is, of course, not evidence that there are indeed no differences, it supports that at least how we measured these constructs in this study and from this particular group, that we were unable to find any. Now, a theist or even, when you make this about theism, but a scientist a psychologist of religion might look at this and say, well, if God's so important, if religion is so central to our psychological functioning and adjustment in the world, how could people who aren't religious, be doing just as good, basically, or just as bad, depending on how you look at it? And tying this back into worldviews, this is one answer, is that we've been failing to measure what non-religious people believe in. And we've only been looking at what religious people believe in, and that religious worldviews are full of non-religious or secular components. There's nothing particularly religious about gathering in a large group, unless perhaps you're in a church, right? And therefore, worship. But atheists do other things, have other beliefs and values that help them navigate the world, and prevent them from being doomed fatalist and nihilist.
Yeah. So to study religious people and atheists, there are also pilgrimage studies where people study pilgrims on their way to some sort of holy place. So, for example, there's the Santiago Way, that people take this way to get to Santiago de Compostela in Spain. And it's not only religious people that do this. You can also find some atheists there.
Right.
So through these kinds of studies, what can we learn about the psychology of religious people and atheists, particularly in terms of their motivations?
To preempt this a little, here's where I like to bring in some lessons that I've been taught from many religious studies colleagues and humanists, and I mean that in the humanities sense, and not like secular humanism, but is that the term religion or pilgrimage, for example, these are heavily value laden, discursive terms that no one can agree what they do or don't mean completely. That they are they do not make for a good scientific category. It's not clean cut because, again, many things that we might consider religious just as easily be considered secular. Is lighting a candle a religious ritual, or is it a secular one? Or not a secular ritual, but you light a candle, the lights go off, or just because you like it. But the only thing that differs between that and lighting a menorah, right? The actions are the same, but we label them differently for some good reasons, but the underlying action is the same. So with terms like religion or pilgrimage, and then back to the worldviews perspective, one of the things that previous social scientists have done, much to my chagrin and others, is to use a concept called implicit religion, whereby, if you said you weren't religious, but then you, went on these long hikes into the woods or, on a pilgrimage, that this was religion manifesting in the non-religious person. And so there was kind of no escape from religion, right? If you weren't explicitly religious, then social scientists would find a set of traits and say, aha, this is your religion. So worldviews allows us to find what people believe in, but not have to infer that it's all implicitly religious. This relates into the pilgrimage because, we understand pilgrimage is usually a religious type ritual, journey as such. Does that mean that atheists don't go on pilgrimages, or that atheists don't even attend church, which are both things that we have found in our own research? Obviously, they're not packing the pews, but some atheists go to church. Doesn't make them religious. Some atheists have walked the pilgrimage in Santiago, Spain, and they didn't consider it a religious ritual, yet traditionally it is. It has been one, but it's a problem of definition. So with that set aside, with my advisor, Dr. Miguel Farias, who I understand you had on a previous episode talk about mindfulness and belief in science, under his guidance, conducted a survey of these pilgrims walking this. Takes several weeks. Is fairly arduous and such, and administered a survey asking about the individual's motivations for walking this. We also measured some psychological traits like positive, negative affect, and also whether or not they had any self-reported mental health problems or symptoms. What we found is that there were no differences between positive, negative affect on our atheist sample, which I think there was about 360 or so total participants, of which roughly half were non-religious atheists. They didn't differ on some of the personality traits. Couldn't find a difference. The atheists did not report more mental health problems. You say, well, why am I bringing this up? There's a long history of painting non-religious individuals and atheists as deviants. Traditionally, they've been, explicitly use an example. Religious studies historian Mircea Eliade said that the non-religious man assumes a tragic existence, and he said this because if they're truly lacking religion, there's major problems. They're lacking part of what it is to be human. Well, if fast forward many years later, in certain studies like Atheists on the Santiago Way that we conducted, where we would expect to find atheists being deficient, and they would be reporting much more health problems. They would be higher on negative affect and low on positive affect compared to theists. It's not what we find. And similarly, when we were looking at fatalism or meaning in life, but one thing we did find, and this isn't surprising, is that when we ask about motivations for taking this long journey, unsurprisingly, religious individuals had more religious motivations or community and family motivations. Some of them doing it as part of the church group. Atheists, on the other hand, did not. Right, so they might be undertaking it, for historical purposes, or just because they enjoy hiking and being outside, and the area is rich with history, and to be together with their partner, or just out of curiosity. So atheists, in more and more studies we're finding, they don't suffer for their atheism as certain social scientific theories and popular individuals would have us believe. They seem to be every bit as normal and adjusted, or as abnormal and maladjusted as theist individuals are.
Mm-hmm. So in your work, I've read about 4 different kinds of religious orientations: intrinsic, extrinsic, quest, and fundamentalist. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, I have done, most of this work has been done by my friends and colleagues. Also, recently, my advisor, Dr. Ralph Hood, University of Tennessee, Chattanooga. And these different orientations are originally, intrinsic and extrinsic orientation were originally derived in the 50s, early 60s by Gordon Allport, who noticed a startling conclusion when they were looking at church attendance and whether or not one believed in God. They found very strong correlations time and time again with prejudice. And so this was, this offended the religious sensibility at the time. We know religion is all the good stuff. What in the world is going on that we're finding it associated with prejudice, racism? So Gordon Allport drew a distinction between what he defined as intrinsic religiosity, which another way of, I'm going to put this crudely, and then this is not what social scientists think, but it's almost like breaking up good and bad religion, if you will. Allport labeled, intrinsic religiosity as being religious as a means unto itself, its own end. That someone who scored high on intrinsic orientation goes to church. They believe because that's truly what they believe, and then they live the life that they believe. Extrinsic religiosity, on the other hand, was defined as religiosity as a sort of exchange system for better health, social relationships, advancement in the community, kind of motivations that are external to the individual, allegedly, versus this kind of pure, so to speak, motivation being internal, intrinsic religiosity. And measuring intrinsic religiosity and extrinsic, time and time again, we find that intrinsic orientation is unrelated to prejudice, usually, and that extrinsic religiosity was related to prejudice. So this kind of satisfied for many years the appetite to make sure that social scientists were looking at the positive aspects of religion and could extract that away from the things that no one wanted to talk about and wanted associated with religion. 20, 30 years later, I think mid-70s or so, psychologist Daniel Bateson added another orientation to intrinsic and extrinsic called, which he termed quest. Quest orientation is interesting. It definitely deviates from the other two and is more I would term kind of a mystical stance. So quest orientation is a type of religiosity that is basically defined as religion as a means to seek truth, and to peer into the unknown, and being okay with that unknown, for example. So quest religiosity is really more of kind of a seeking for knowledge that usually takes on a religious flavor, and more closely associated with some kind of mystical traditions and so forth. And forgetting the fourth.
Fundamentalist.
Okay. It's not, there is some disagreement or argumentation over whether it would be considered an orientation exactly like this intrinsic and extrinsic, but fundamentalism, these are, the Bible said it, I believe it, that's the end of the story. Yeah. And not, so these individuals are very assured in their belief. Unfettered, unwavering, and take a more rigid stance, and less, they are not kind of searching on a quest for eternal truth the way a quest individual might be. Here, when we typically talk about more kind of fundamentalist orientations, here is where we might, if you might call your true believers, so to speak, these people really live out what they believe. And give an example, serpent handlers of Appalachia in the Appalachian regions, mountains of along the eastern, southeastern America, are usually considered behind fundamentalism. They take a very literal interpretation of a certain scripture and the New Testament and Mark that says these signs shall follow them that believe. That they will be able to handle deadly serpents, drink deadly poisons, and nothing, not that nothing bad should happen to them, but that God is in control. Fundamentalists, many of these individuals really do. And has caused much uproar in the Southeast, interestingly, among religious communities, right? So here we have a case, whether, like atheist provoking religious individuals. We have two groups, unsurprisingly here, who understand the Bible and Christianity in drastically different ways. So different in the case of the Church of Holiness members that they're, handling cottonmouth, venomous snakes or serpents, and actually, in some cases, drinking strychnine or other very deadly substances. So, and people often look at them as they're, they think they're crazy, but they point to the Bible and take a very literal interpretation and say, we're not crazy. We are living out the commandments that have been provided to us. So fundamentalist orientation is more commonly associated with scriptural literalism, taking word for word. Of course, they pick different parts of the Bible, but taking word for word what it said and living that out.
Religious people tend to say that atheists, because they don't have God in their life, for example, are not able to derive value nor meaning from anything. But are there any sources that atheists have at their disposal from which they derive value and meaning?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is one of, again, kind of under the rubric of investigating the worldviews of atheists and non-believers. This is one of the central components. So another way where some individuals might put that religion is central to good psychological functioning, another way of putting that is having values, making meaningful connections with others, sharing those beliefs, whatever they are, values with community, and finding meaning in what you do. That's what's critical for psychological functioning. For some people, it's religion. For others, it's not. So in this case, we've found in one study, again with a nationally a representative national sample, that atheists and theists, as well as religious and non-religious individuals, and the distinction there is religiosity defined as essentially like church attendance, and then theist defined as whether or not one believes. That we didn't find any differences between again, we talked about fatalism and determinism, but we did find one difference. Atheists, non-religious individuals, were more likely than theists to say that source of meaning was internally derived. Essentially, life is only meaningful. The question asks, is life only meaningful if you provide the meaning yourself? And atheists, yes, they said yes. Theists said no, which is understandable here in this distinction, but it also speaks more and more to what we know about how atheists derive meaning, is that it is, in some of the qualitative interviews and research I've done with participants, as well as quantitative studies, we found that atheists are aware that there is kind of a fundamental existential problem that has been written about for eons. How to purpose, meaning. If life isn't meaningful, then what are we doing? Why bother? Therefore, it is important to kind of understand, and people have to confront these questions somehow. Not everyone does it in the way an academic or a philosopher might. But you need to come up with some answers to what's the value of this? What about why love my family? Why do this? And we find that atheists are, again, this shouldn't surprise anyone. Atheists do not find the root of meaning or derive their meaning from religious sources. So whereas the inverse of that, many religious individuals, they will certainly cite God as the source, value, meaning, purpose, but they also include many, sources that overlap with atheists. So, for example, family is meaningful. Family, friends, educational activities are often cited by non-religious atheist individuals as meaningful, goals that they have and that are of value in their life. I think some others. And part of this is it's a little bit difficult to articulate these because non-religious individuals lack. When we talk about religion, we have one word. We God, one word. It's more different, and we often again take all of these things to be similar, or that everyone's referring to the same thing when they say religion. When we take that out of the equation, we're trying to understand all. Does someone have humanistic values, or do they just call it the golden rule, or do they just have like a personal life philosophy that you should be good to everyone and hopefully they'll be good back to you? So how to collect all of these different sources of meanings or values under labels that we can use to do research is something we're actively working on. Some other examples of sources of kind of atheist or non-religious meaning, and I don't mean again to bracket these into that only atheists find meaning in science, for example. They are more likely to highly value science and such for the search for truth and also kind of what it gives us. But it would be very wrong, especially doing this interview during COVID and all, to say that science is not meaningful and highly valuable. But typically non-religious individuals do cite finding meaning actually in science more than non-religious individuals. And they also display more, again, more liberal values and things that we could kind of label as humanistic values. Being kind to your neighbor, social justice causes, and studies we've done. Many atheists report they find meaning in political and local activism. A recent study found that a study of vegans in America found that atheists were over almost 3/4 of the sample identified as a non-believer. And here is a group of individuals who are espousing a concern, a value, judgment that they should not eat animals. Whether you agree with that or not, different thing. But it's a a value. It provides meaning and some direction about what to do or what not to do in life. And lastly, and closely related to science, is nature. Just hiking. The beauty of the natural world for many individuals is what's listed when we say, where do you, what is valuable to you? What's meaningful? And people range from, said just taking a hike in the woods to describing how, thanks to science and medical advances, their grandmother, grandfather didn't suffer as much from a disease or something, or even better, it allowed them to understand something that's basically invisible to the germs and things and sickness to the most humans here. It allowed them to situate this uncertainty within a context of this is what is happening, and instead of, for example, being possessed by an evil spirit, for which we, explains your crazy behavior, we can understand it's a mix-up in chemicals in your brain, or, because you're suffering from Alzheimer's. And these, science and this context provides a meaningful narrative to understand the way the world is. Sometimes, and people, next question might be, well, science seems kind of cold, hard, and objective. Just the facts. Yes, this is one part of science, but if you were, read Stephen Hawking, or they're gonna kill me for who am I missing? The listeners are going to kill me for missing name. Who did the Cosmos series?
Carl Sagan.
Yes, sorry. See, I drew a blank. I have books behind me. So, if you had Carl Sagan in front of you, I think the last thing he would say is that science just provides us with cold, hard facts. It exposes a world that many non-religious and religious people find awe-inspiring, wondrous, explains things and creates new mysteries that individuals find is meaningful to solve. So, yeah.
Okay, so does atheism have any evolutionary basis to it? I mean, I've already had some of the main figures in the cognitive science of religion on the show, like Edward Slingerland, Robert Macaulay, Joseph Bulbuli, and others. And it seems that, at least according to their research, that religion is a natural phenomenon and atheism would be unnatural in a way. So do you agree with that? And if so, I mean, would it have any evolutionary basis to it, or would it be simply something cultural, for example?
I do, and I've seen a few of those guys on here, and they're all colleagues and friends. So I'll try not to step on too many toes. But they also know that I would disagree, or and the root of some of these disagreements I think are more definitional than empirical. So some of the arguments essentially that religion is natural and atheism are not, when you peel back the layers and dig into some of these readings, two things immediately appear, and we can connect these to earlier in the podcast. Studies have typically measured atheism or non-religion is something that's lacking. So one reason this has occurred is because for the longest time, cognitive science has only sought to essentially explain religiosity, which makes sense, right? Religiosity is culturally pervasive. Well back into history, we have supernatural phenomena, rituals, and so forth, right? So that certainly commands explaining, and probably explaining first. One of the problems with explaining that first, though, is religion's other didn't have a stake kind of at a fair chance, so to speak. If you explain for example, if you explain atheism if you explain religion by having good theory of mind skills, good mentalizing skills, that almost means by proxy that you should expect non-religious individuals to have bad theory of mind or mentalizing skills. And we don't find that. And then an occasional study has found these, but more recently in more high-powered studies in different countries and so forth, we don't find differences between atheists and theists here. So one of the key arguments for the naturalness of religious beliefs are that they stem from our theory of mind mentalizing system. I wholly agree with, or in part stem from those systems. I wholly agree with that, but at the same time, and I think some of the same authors you mentioned would likely agree with this, that doesn't make atheism unnatural, because our theory of mind systems it's at such a basic cognitive level that mentalizing skills, theory of mind system, gives us politics, allows us to communicate. It gives us countries, cities, commerce, exchanges. So it's, and as they would all tell you, it's in no way unique to religion. Mm-hmm. It is a foundation of religion. But in one conversation with Robert McCauley had at a conference, I written a little on his book, Why Religion is Natural and Science is Not. Mm-hmm. And warned about being careful for providing such low-level explanations that we say essentially, oxygen is critically important for religious beliefs. Were we not able to breathe or have a heart that pumps blood, people couldn't be religious. But this is true and trivial. I think the major focus on cognitive science and psychology of religion has been to understand and explain religiosity. And few people, it's only again with the past 8-10 years that people have sought to understand and explain atheism. Mm-hmm. And there's still, one of the things I've been working on with other colleagues is developing, kind of revising what we understand cognitively about atheists and the non-religious. So kind of back to this natural, religion is natural and non-religion is not theme. Yes, we know supernatural beliefs present in all cultures that we know, stretching as far back as we can tell. But we also know skepticism was present in these cultures. And that, for example, different hunter-gatherer groups today have expressed skepticism over, unseen agents, God, supernatural forces. Not everyone in these societies, believes. There's considerable room for skepticism and doubt. And in some societies, the gods are around, but it would be strange to say someone believes in them. So in the same sense that I have knowledge that supernatural agents exist and I can transmit this to other people, I also don't believe in this knowledge. So getting slightly off track here, but is so atheism, non-religion. We usually divide up kind of two different systems, collections of different cognitive systems or psychological tendencies, and it's imperfect. Because there's a lot of philosophy and how do you want to cut the pie kind of when we're talking about the human brain, and typically religious ideas are obviously easy to transmit, widespread, and popular, right? So there's a sense in which we all certainly have a supernatural side. We hear a bump in the night and we think, who's there, before we think it was just a twig, that fell from a tree. But on the in contrast to that, we also have a skeptic side. We don't believe in some gods and not others. Where we scrutinize information that is given to us. And I believe the roots of the skepticism and the atheism are similar to religion, part biological, and certainly in large part cultural, as well as religion. So, for example, blindly following, take it back to caveman times, and you hear a noise in a cave, and your fellow Stone Age gentleman or gentlewoman goes in there to investigate, but doesn't come back out. People are able to deduce, if you keep sending people into a cave and you hear scary noises from it, at some point you might want to stop sending people in, right? Critically thinking something bad is happening in there, my people aren't coming out. Now, some of these same systems that allows us to reason about causality and to scrutinize things that are happening in the world like that also allow us to be skeptical of religious claims. And so I think two things. I do think perhaps in an uninteresting way that religion and atheism has biological roots, in the same way that my ability to do science, for example, depends on our understanding of causality and our theory of mind skills. Where we would have great problems if scientists couldn't imagine a thought experiment or imagine what could happen if they did this and not that, right? So the same skills that underline, that support religiosity, I would argue to different degrees, also support atheism and things like scientific thinking. The difference, I think, is that I will agree that atheism is a bit harder, or atheism, but skepticism can be a bit harder to spread when certain ideas are extremely sticky, like religious ideas. But we also know that the best predictor of who is religious and who is not is, your local culture, the town you grew up in, your parents. And this is not surprising, because if we're talking about the level of cognition, it's at a very basic level. And so oftentimes people are talking about two different things. When some of these individuals say religion is natural, how the term religion is used really matters here. Because some people so certain individuals, for example, maybe David Sloan Wilson, who I've had the pleasure to interview on other podcasts, he would consider, or open to considering, atheist as another type of religion, and it would just be a godless religion. Mm-hmm. So many of these claims depend on how we want to cut up, the pie here, so to speak, of what counts for religion and what isn't. So, ritual activities, very natural to engage in. Is all ritual religious? No, we have a swearing in ceremony in the U.S. and among many others. It's a ritual. Is it religion? That depends on your perspective. So I think when people say religion is natural and atheism is not, this is really code for we have evolved to form meaningful relationships with others, find value, purpose in an ultimately purposeless universe from a universal kind of, teleologic point of view. And that we do have certain tendencies to believe in supernatural agents, and not just limited to God. We have leprechauns, witches, magic, and the saying religion is natural is also saying belief in leprechauns and fire breathing dragons are. And I don't say this to kind of knock down the arguments, but when cognitive scientists say religion is natural, they're meaning the whole suite of supernatural beliefs that one could possibly have come easy to us. And it is a bit harder not to engage in magical thinking, even for atheists. It's certainly possible, and many atheists do, but it's tempting sometimes.
Yeah, I understand. Okay, so one last question. I know that you have a postdoc project titled Religion, Ideology, and Prosociality, Simulating Secularizing Societies. Could you tell us a little bit about it? What are the kinds of things that you want to study there?
Great. Thanks for asking this. And to clarify, though, it's not my project personally. I'm thankful. It's a project led by Dr. Konrad Talmont-Kaminsky at the University of Bialystok and the Society and Cognition Unit, as well as Dr. Laurent Schultz in Norway. And so on this project, we're going to combine survey methods, experimental methods, with this new huge supercomputer that we have for this project. It's called Thor, and it does. I can't even say it. Like, I don't know the proper words because I am not a computer scientist in that sense. But it's a massive computer that's going to allow us to combine existing knowledge about religion and other ideologies. So it's prosociality. It's studying religion from a perspective of ideologies. And this also would include secular ideologies, humanism. And I'm not using ideology with a negative context here, just in the sense that kind of like a belief system. So we're going to study how different ideologies affect pro-social tendencies in a population, and also how different ideologies spread. And this will, again, involve different survey instruments and computer modeling, where we will work to simulate. I like to tell people it's a little bit like SimCity. If you've ever played, well, it's not, it literally isn't looking at a screen with people walking around with a bubble over their head, but we are able to grow societies based on our best scientific knowledge about how the mind works and how people interact. And we have different agents who go around, they have lifespans, they can get married, they die. If we want them to go to church, they do that. And we can run experiments that we otherwise would be difficult or cost prohibitive to survey or experimental wise. We can do them in silico with computer modeling, and we can see how the dynamics of what happens if we increase nationalism and decrease religiosity. But for example, one of the problems we encounter and that we're working on now is, how do we disentangle, or do we? What are the circumstances in which nationalism is different from religiosity, and so on? That is one of the things we will be undertaking in this new project.
Yeah, very interesting. Okay, so just before we go, where can people find your work on the internet?
It's thomascoleman.guru. So it's my name, thomascoleman.guru, Guru. I have papers and podcasts and so on up there, and most everything. Try to keep everything free to download. So yeah, it's hopefully some people might be interested. It's just good to be read.
Yeah, great. Okay, so Thomas, thank you for coming on the show. It was really fun to talk to you, to talk with you. So.
Thank you so much.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel back in February 2018 and have been putting out regular interviews with top academics and scholars from a variety of fields. So to keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please pay a visit to my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. If you prefer PayPal, I also have links to that in the description box of the video. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please leave a like, share it, and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litske and Blanchett Pererga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Kessel, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Anian Kata, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollesy, Henrik Alenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetriou, Robert Windegar, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zoop, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Spinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Mikkel Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Yugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Don Ross, João Alves da Silva, Jonathan Librant, Oslam Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Deza Araújo, Eden Solan, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londonio Correa, Tom Roth, and Yannick Punter. My producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Sergio Codriano, Luís Caetano, Matthew Lavender, Tom Vanegdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, and Niruban Balachandran, and my executive producers, Michal Ruzhevsky, Rosie, and James Pratt. Thank you for all.